Our friend Stephen A. Smith on NBA Countdown had this to say.
We all know very few people on the planet have been more critical of Kyrie Irving than me over the last several years. I haven't said a negative word about him this year because there's nothing negative to say. He has been phenomenal. He's been a phenomenal player. He's been a phenomenal leader. He's been a phenomenal citizen, an ambassador for the game of basketball. To transition, to get away from the noise that was so self-inflicted on so many occasions, to get to transition to a point of near perfection. I can't say enough about him.
So that's the setup for the conversation. So, Windy, if one were to say that the postseason run the Mavericks are making that could end in a championship here will be more significant to the legacy of Kyrie Irving than that of Luka Doncic, what would you say?
I completely disagree because Kyrie Irving's already got a tremendously impressive postseason legacy. He's already proven he can be a champion. He's already proven he can deliver in the clutch. And I listen to people talk every day on this show and other shows and out in the world, wherever I am, when they come up to me and they talk about, needing a championship. Charles Barkley practically has to hear every single day of the year, despite him being a top 50 all-time player, that he's somehow less than without a championship. So how can you say in that context that we live in, and not only just media and fans, but players, peers tease each other and rip each other with not having a championship? How can you look at Luka and say that he's going to be one of the all-time greats and then say it's less important for him? I just think if you're going to make that a judgment point, then you can't move the goalposts. This is about Luka. This is Luka trying to prove he can do this, and it's about Kyrie supporting him there, which is a role Kyrie is embracing. He should be applauded for that, already having his ring.
Absolutely. And that's why this conversation needs to have something that very few conversations in the modern world unfortunately have, which is nuance. Which is to say, yes, Luka Doncic is playing for a degree of immortality he does not currently possess. No one is arguing with that. He is a great player, and the solidification of that greatness that comes with winning a championship is inarguable. I don't think Alan and I, who see this thing differently, I don't think either of us would disagree with that thought. What I would say, however, is that I think Kyrie Irving is a player whose legacy has been extremely complicated. I sat there on NBA Countdown for 2 years as he was described as toxic, as he was at one point suspended from his own team for 5 games because he was, quote, unfit to be associated with them. Through the entirety, period, new subject, the entirety of the COVID piece of this, where whatever side of that you fell on and whatever it looks like in the light of day, he wasn't there for any of the home games, all of that, the complete debacle that was the tenure that he had with Kevin Durant in Brooklyn. I would venture to say a year ago today, people would not have suggested that that Kyrie had this left in him, that he was going to wind up being sort of a mercenary whose career was going to peter out and it was going to be more about unfulfilled potential greatness than about the brilliance that we all see him have with the basketball in his hand. And I think that is what's being rewritten now, and that's why I think his legacy piece of this is every bit as significant.
We talked about, I think you have the legacy piece with people on the outside and what they determine is important, because a lot of that is manufactured by the media. And let's be honest, like a lot of those things we talked about were pushed by the media on a day-to-day basis because we sell things like that. It's a polarizing subject matter. We didn't even dig into during COVID that there were a litany of other players that weren't vaccinated that didn't have the same mandate because of the city. And by the way, things worked out in New York City. It's a completely different story on the back end if we're really being real about it. So I think with inside basketball walls, we know the legacy of Kyrie because we know how special what talent he is. We've seen that LeBron James had a title in Cleveland because Kyrie made one of the biggest shots in Cleveland basketball history. So every single day when we talk about Luka, it's similar to Josh Allen. I said this the other day in the conference call. It's like, how many times are you going to be the favorite before you win a championship? So we all know this is Luka's style of basketball in which they're playing. And Kyrie has to fit into Luka's style of basketball. So for me, I think this says more about Luka than it will about Kyrie.
Did you think the Nets should have signed Kyrie to a long-term huge contract?
I would not have signed Kyrie to a long-term.
Why?
I think it was more so because of the relationship between Kyrie and KD and James Harden, the way that worked out and how it was positioned from the beginning about whose team it was.
But Jay, understand something that Greeny's explaining here is that you use the word toxic. when they had to trade him, there weren't a lot of teams that wanted to bring him in because of all the things that preceded him at that point. They weren't talking about what he could bring basketball-wise. What the Mavericks did and Nico Harrison did was take a risk. And last year, it felt like, you know what, he's not playing. He and Luka never on the court together. This is a mistake. And it wasn't, because what we're seeing out of him right now, this is like a renaissance for him because there's joy in his game. You see how beautiful he plays the game, and we are no longer thinking anything other than what he's become. And if he wins a championship, all that stuff suddenly goes away, and he goes back to elevating himself into one of the all-time greats to ever play.
I knew I was going to need more time than this for this. Yeah. Monica, give us a thought. Go ahead. Take your time.
I think two things can be true a bit. I might change the word of rewriting and add continuing to, or and change it to adding to his legacy, right? I think we got to remember how unique our pandemic experience was, y'all. And that was polarizing, to your point, Greeny, whatever side you were on. But Kyrie, in terms of basketball, was never the question. But that is such a historic time and moment in terms of what could be argued as a misstep and earning a label of toxic. Not to mention the Brooklyn experiment had actual basketball reasons that it didn't necessarily work as well. And so I agree with Jay in that I never questioned that Kyrie could get back to this in terms of the basketball of it all. But we're looking at it from a basketball conversation to a sports and sports characters conversation. And I think that's where we're probably missing one another.
All right, we're going to need a lot more time to do this conversation justice, because it is, as I said before, it requires the one thing that far too few conversations in our world have today, which is nuance and depth. And we'll try and get some time for that as we continue.
I'm on fire.